You can do it. Folks, please take your seats in the back, please. Thank you. Supervisor Miley's on the dais. Thank you very much. Supervisor.
So good afternoon, everyone. Those of you who are here this morning, welcome back. Those of you who are just joining us, welcome. Those of you who happen to be watching this live streamed or webcast, hi. We're back from halftime. We're going to start the second half of the game. Though our audience has thinned out a little since this morning, I do think the fact that all of you are here and maybe those of you who are viewing are going to add value to this afternoon and find this afternoon to be of value to you. And don't forget to fill out your survey evaluation form before you leave, so it helps us to be better informed for the next time we do this. So we had a real good first half with Dr. Mann, Lori Ajax, and Robert Parrott, all from the state of California. They were down this morning, provided a lot of good, useful information, and people got an opportunity to ask a number of very intelligent and useful questions. So I'm confident this afternoon will go just as well as we focus in on cannabis and its effects and how we can address it and de-emphasize it among young people, and how we send a message to the public, to adults and educators and others. So this afternoon we have two panels. In the first panel, if those folks want to come on up here and join me, Nancy O'Malley, who's our district attorney, she's here. And, Nancy actually has one of her staff that's on the county internal working group, because the county has a working group made up of all the county agencies and departments. There are a couple of them that aren't on the working group that is meeting on how we move ahead with addressing this new industry. So I'm really pleased that Nancy's here this afternoon. Susan FANELLI, who's the Assistant Director, California Department of Public Health. She's here with us this afternoon. Chris HALSOR, he's a Colorado attorney and founder of Understanding Legal Marijuana, and he's a former DA in Colorado. Heard he has a lot of useful and informative information for us, and really pleased that he was able to come out today. And I want to thank the organizations for helping to get him here. And then Robert RAICH, who's an attorney specializing in cannabis law. And I've known Robert since my days on the Oakland City Council. Just for a quick aside, when Proposition 215 was passed in 1996, Robert was one of the people who spoke with me when I was an Oakland City Council person about having the city of Oakland begin to look at medical cannabis. And it was from that point on that I became convinced that medical cannabis had legitimacy as a result of Robert and other people working with me on that. And we established, similar to what we have in Alameda County, an internal working group made up of the city manager, the chief of police, and the city attorney to work on establishing Oakland's laws back in the late 90s. And Robert was very instrumental in that, working with my office at the time. So it's kind of like deja vu, and known Robert for a long time. And Robert's a constituent of mine too, so there's a lot of things about Robert. So I'm really very pleased to have the four of them here this afternoon. And with that being said, I'm going to now turn it over to Nancy O'Malley, our district attorney, who's
Supervisor?
Wonderful.
I'm sorry, sir. May we have a group photo, please?
You guys want a photo?
Yes.
You guys want to get a photo?
Sure. Right here.
Okay.
In front. Thank you.
Yeah, I think they want us down
here. Yes, right there. He knows. Nate knows. Audience, feel free to take a picture as well.
So this afternoon session is really important, and as I was about to say, you know, Nancy O'Malley, the district attorney, has done a lot of innovative, cutting-edge programs and endeavors here in Alameda County. She's recognized throughout the state. I think is probably one of the best DAs in the state of California. So I'm really pleased that Nancy's here this afternoon to kick us off.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and welcome everyone for being here. This is really an important issue to all of us here in Alameda County, not the least of which is that we want to make sure that the law is implemented the way that it's written. And from my perspective, that people that are involved in the industry are also safe and aren't in jeopardy of being harmed, because we're really doing a paradigm shift from having it be once illegal to then medicinal use of marijuana to now having commercial use and commercial sales. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. What I wanted to talk with the audience about is that there are certain rights that are written into the law. I'm going to start with talking about how those who had previously been convicted of marijuana-based crimes now have the opportunity to either have their convictions set aside and expunged from the record or reduced from a felony level to a misdemeanor. I will say in Alameda County we have very few. I don't even remember, at least in the last 10 years, of us prosecuting a marijuana-based case unless it was involved a crime of violence like a homicide or something like that. I will talk about Prop 64 and what the law says about that, and then also Prop 47, which we passed 2 years ago, that has allowed us to reduce certain felony crimes to misdemeanors. Along with that, I'll talk about Clean Slate, and that's really the program that we have. I'm going to talk about my office and how we are looking at the new legal cannabis transactions, and then ultimately preventing violence in the cannabis business. So just, I know you've heard a lot of detail this morning about the law and the regulations, but part of the Prop 64 was to authorize people to either be resentenced for prior crimes that involved marijuana in some form, either personal possession or transportation or sales. It does allow the person to bring a petition to have that conviction either set aside, expunged, or ultimately or reduced to a misdemeanor. As you all know, you heard this morning, I won't go into too much detail other than what the law does authorize now. And the import of why I'm including this particular slide of what the law now allows is because with the change in the law, it means that for people that were subject to those types of crimes or that type of activity are now eligible to come back to court to file a petition to have the conviction set aside or reduced. So reducing a prior felony conviction to a misdemeanor is done under certain circumstances. It's not automatic. Unlike Prop 47, which I'll talk about in just a second, there are some conditions that might prohibit or stop the court from granting a petition, but for sure it has to be done through a petition process. And what that means is that somebody needs to file a petition in court. They need to serve my office so that we can go to court. But as we have done with Proposition 47, that we look at the petitions between us and the attorney or the individual. We know that we're going to agree under Prop 47 about 99% of the time. And so we make those agreements in the office, and then we just present together a petition to the court for signature. So we've streamlined that pretty effectively. And the same is true for Prop 64. A lot of people have already had their convictions set aside or reduced under Prop 47, but Prop 64 we're now seeing about 15 to 20 a week in our court down below. So the word is out, and we're relying also and partnering with our community partners to make sure that people are aware. This just goes into more of what the law says, which you have. And so generally speaking, the petitions for expungement, and that means that it's completely removed from the record. The arrest, any charges, and any convictions are completely removed from the record. The expungement can be denied if the person possessed more than an ounce of marijuana or was growing more than 6 plants, but they still may be eligible to have that reduced down to a misdemeanor so it doesn't show as a felony conviction. And then the court can always find that the petitioner is deemed to present an unreasonable risk of danger to public safety. Under Prop 47, the types of crimes that are specific that would be covered or be overlapped with Prop 64 are the personal use, possession, drugs, cocaine, marijuana, methamphetamine, and other scheduled drugs. Those are all now misdemeanors, although with marijuana, now it's not anything. But there are other types of crimes that fall under Prop 47, and you can see this here. What we have done is we have, with our Prop 47, and I've shared with you about Prop 64 petitions, we're only seeing about 15 a week, but with Prop 47, we're doing 100 a week. And we're doing that because if we waited and just went 30 a week as the court would like, then it would take a very long time for people to get the relief that Prop 47 allows. And so we've created this system where we're just streamlining a lot of these petitions because we know we're going to agree on what the outcome will be. And there's no reason to not just move it along on the ones that we agree on. Let me talk a little bit about the whole new industry, the legal industry of cannabis transactions. And that is that very clearly my office and I am committed to the fair and reasonable enforcement of the criminal laws governing cannabis transaction. And what that means is that all the regulations that you heard about earlier this morning, or those that we're hearing about through the permitting process and what each county and the cities are doing around authorization of either grows or of businesses that are being licensed, that we're going to do everything as we would with every other legitimate business, and that is to protect it and to make sure that the employees and those working in that industry are safe and protected. It will fall on several agencies. We heard from many of them this morning, and we're now compiling what each of the cities that are taking some action or authorizing some action in their city within their jurisdiction, and certainly our county, which has been out front on this in preparation for January 1 of 2018 to make sure we are ready with all of our policies in place. And then I'll just really point out one last thing, and that is that the law applies to adults who are over 21. And one of the issues that we are really looking at now, and by we, I mean my office with an advisory group that I have around this, is the advertising of the marijuana, the access to marijuana with targeting younger people, and turning to our partners in public health to help guide us through the same process that we went through when we were stopping cigarette or tobacco advertising being aimed at young people. Lastly, we're working with the marijuana operators and growers and distributors really to prevent crime. We want them to be safe. We want to make sure that when they are leaving the business, that they're not followed, that they're not in jeopardy of someone thinking they've got product, or they're going to a bank with cash, and that they're going to be targeted. So we're working very closely with the industry to make sure that their security measures are in place, and we are there to make sure that people are safe as they're either doing the business or are perceived as or misinterpreted as having something that would make them vulnerable to a person trying to rob them or to stop them from getting where they're going. You said about the advertising, and then we're just working on other strategies that we can help for the legal licensed, permitted operations to be able to do their business, and then make sure that there's going to be a big transition. I know there was some discussion this morning about small businesses or small industry members who are not the larger corporations. And so we're very much aware of that dynamic and working with those industries as well. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you, Nancy. We have about 5 minutes at the moment for questions, and we'll have questions again at the end. with all the panelists. But does anybody have a question that they want to ask the DA at this point in time? Yeah. Like I said, we've got 5 minutes, so.
Actually, I have a couple. Bob Butler, KCBS Radio. So as I understand it, you have to have a license to transport marijuana. So if I go to a retailer and I buy it for my own personal use and I'm driving home and I get stopped by the police, am I subject to being prosecuted?
Not if, well, you don't have to have a license to purchase and then take it home. You have to have a license if you're into industry and you're a permitted licensed grower who's then delivering product to a storefront or somewhere.
If I'm a distributor and I have the license, I have my bill of lading and everything, and I'm riding down the freeway and I get stopped by the Border Patrol, what's my liability?
I would like to say there's a clear answer to that, but I don't have one. But I think maybe one of my colleagues here on the panel will have a better sense of that, who has more exposure of dealing with the across state lines.
Because that's what I'm really curious about. Because it's still a federal crime. How do you handle that?
I can probably try and answer that. Technically, if you were stopped by a federal agency, because it is a federal crime, you could be subject to that. However, based on how the U.S. Attorney's Office handles these cases, if you're traveling down the road and you've got, I don't know, 100 pounds, 200 pounds, you might be in trouble with the feds. If you've got your lawful ounce in California, I would be very hard pressed to think that the feds are going to do anything about it.
Well, and I'll just add that, under the 10th Amendment, the states have the right to mandate laws of their own states. And so, unless there's a targeted reason for the feds to be involved in enforcement at the state level, then that they wouldn't necessarily be driving down the highway making car stops.
I say this because Attorney General Sessions has made it very clear he wants to prosecute marijuana crimes. So.
If I can speak to that one, there's why this has all been permitted to exist, where you have states who are pushing this forward with either medical or recreational systems, is in part because of what is referred to as the Ogden Memo, and subsequently the Cole Memo, which was from the U.S. Department of Justice, and they sort of laid out the priorities when it came to how the U.S. government was going to approach these cases. Despite Attorney General Sessions' specific statements and dislike of marijuana, he has said that the priorities laid out in the Cole Memo are actually reasonable priorities and likely ones that the feds are going to follow. And therefore, what is laid out are things you would expect. Organized crime, guns and drugs, selling to kids, high things that nobody in this audience would disagree about. So that's why I said, and I agree with Nancy on this, if they were pulling somebody over, it's because they're targeting them for something bigger
Okay.
than just having an ounce.
So 2 more questions? Yes.
Good afternoon. My name is Robert Turner. I'm a CPA. In the last slide, you mentioned that there is banking and depositing procedures. Is it still illegal to deposit funds into a FDIC lender?
Well, this is a big discussion that's going on right now in California. I know Betty, our own treasurer here, who's sitting over there, Hank Levy, is really focusing on this because we want people to be able to deposit money wherever they're depositing it in whatever form it is safely. And so the banking, I don't want to be the expert on this because I always turn to Hank to explain it more to me, or to our treasurer, Betty Yee, to explain it more. I know that there are some community banks that are accepting deposits, and there's some paperwork that they have to do in addition to accepting the money. I think there is a lot of thought going on right now about how the industry can safely deposit money without being up against some of the federal rules around the national banks. But I'm not the banking expert, but we have one right here in the audience, and I know this is a big issue for us. He and I have talked quite a bit about it, and people are trying to figure out what is the solution.
Thank you. Will she be part of the panel today, or will she be able to?
Oh, Hank Levy, the treasurer?
Treasurer, yes.
No, but that's going to be part of our summit in the summer. banking and taxation. We couldn't cover everything today, but we're queuing that up for July.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Hi there, Corinne Smith with KPFA News. Can you talk about the DUI standard, and are police departments clear? Is there a clear standard for levels of intoxication?
Well, there are clear standards for level of intoxication for alcohol, but not for marijuana or cannabis. And there's a lot of discussion around that. If looking at other states to see what they're doing, I think Colorado has identified a standard. But ultimately, and I think this is the way it would be looked at with prescription drugs, that if somebody's under the influence of a prescription drug and they're driving, that they could be found guilty of driving under the influence of drug or alcohol. There isn't a set standard like what we have with alcohol. I know there's a research project that's going on right now. It's been going on for quite some time to try to identify if something exists, some kind of a recognized standard. But for right now, if somebody was suspected to be under the influence of marijuana, just like any other prescription drug, it really comes down to factually how they're driving, what the influence of that drug is, but not a standard.
Okay, so thank you. So once again, we'll circle back, and if you have other questions of Nancy or any of the panelists at the end, we'll have time for questions. And I just want to let folks know, I didn't read their bios. It's in the program, so look in the program book and you can see the background of the 4 panelists that are up here this afternoon. So now I'm going to turn to Chris, and he's going to cue up the second presentation.
All right. Okay. So my name is Chris HALSOR, and as I was introduced, I am a Colorado lawyer. I spent 14 years as a prosecutor and was very much on the front end of legalization in Colorado beginning about 2009. I'm here because I accidentally raised my hand in a staff meeting and said, I'll take the marijuana issue. So in that time, I've developed, I travel around the country and I teach on this. So for this presentation, I only have a brief period of time, but I was asked to address a whole laundry list of things. And I know that there are some things out there that have already been talked about. One of the things was just product in general, and understand that the definition that was provided in Prop 64 is very broad. And so as we can imagine, what's going to be accessible and available is going to be a whole lot more than what's in the picture here, what historically people believe. And so it's any part of the plant, anything you can derive from it. Good old-fashioned marijuana we'll call bud or flower. And the dispensaries, of course, will get to go sell this stuff. One of my all-time favorite slides is to talk about strains. Strains are fascinating. And here were some that in the retail stores, once they open up, this is a lot of times how bud flower is marketed and sold. And so, but there's a lot of other things, and I know one of the purposes of the summit was sort of to discuss issues with youth. This is a subject where I think, from parents to educators, public health and public safety issues, it's just educating yourself about the products that are out there, so that you can discuss it with people and be familiar with it. It's also, I like to speak of fluency when we talk about things. So when we talk about this stuff, there's a range of things. Potency or THC concentration tends to be one of the issues out there. People who smoked 10, 20, 30 years ago, in all likelihood, it was probably floating around the, 2 to 8% range. High strains were maybe low teens, things like that. I would probably venture a guess when stores open in January, just for bud flower alone, average is going to be 15 to 30% just for bud flower. other things along the way. The big one is concentrates, which are the concerns because we're averaging about 70, low 90% THC. As this industry is allowed to grow, they learn new techniques, new products out there. Distillate is one of the newer ones out there that is commonly advertised as 95 to 99% pure THC. So it's becoming familiar with the product, knowing what's out there and what you choose. Clearly, edibles are one of those topics out there, and I think, you know, California has had medical, it's the oldest medical state there is. And so it's not to say that the state doesn't have some familiarity with this, but now you are going to have the public with greater access to it. And let's simply face it, is tourism. You're going to have lots of people who come to California, maybe for other reasons, and are going to take advantage of this. And one of the areas that edibles can sometimes cause public health and public safety issues is just familiarity, because sometimes there's a perception gap. And the perception is that edibles are the starter kit. That if you want to introduce yourself to this, you should go with edibles. Well, the issue is that they're manufactured with concentrate, and the mechanism of delivery is different. When you smoke marijuana, it tends to go up into your blood, into your brain within a couple minutes. That high lasts probably most intensely for the first hour and then starts to wane off. But with edibles, it has to process through your stomach and your digestive tract. And of course, when stores open in January and the public walks in, somebody might go in and buy a candy bar, and the people working behind the counter, the bud tenders, might suggest to them that they snap off one square of that candy bar and eat it and wait 20 minutes to 2 hours for the effects to set in. And of course, we, being the patient society that we are, when those results don't start to register, people have a tendency to eat the whole thing. And even really experienced marijuana users will talk about edibles can really mess you up. And what they'll tend to do is that delayed mechanism of delivery, there has to be sometimes some public education about that, because the high itself can also last for a really long time. And doing what I do, I've certainly met a lot of people on both sides of the argument, and some marijuana consumers, and I certainly have a few people who have said they've had a few bad experiences with edibles. And so I think education piece, even from a local government standpoint, of, you know, when we do have people coming to Alameda County and things like that to enjoy themselves for other reasons, you know, not only is it the businesses who are trying to educate, but does the government itself have any responsibility in that? And yes, there's always a whole litany of products there tends to err on the sweet side, but there's a lot of stuff. And people it's hunting season, so. You know, there's lots of products out there that's available. And again, this is sort of the free enterprise piece of it, is that you're going to have the people out there who are manufacturing. And I went to lunch with some people who were talking about the regulatory piece of how do we solve this. And when we're manufacturing infused products, including foods, there's a huge regulatory curve. And I can tell you, having been involved in this since 2009, which I'm like a total ancient grandpa in marijuana world when it comes to this stuff, there's a learning curve. And I think for Alameda County and for the cities in the state who are trying to solve this, like, you're going to keep having to learn and adjust and fix and come to a lot of different things, because it's a new industry. And the reality is that policy is outstripping a lot of things, including the science. There are a lot of things, because it remains illegal federally, that it is difficult to study. Let me give you guys just an example of this. This one's interesting. And of course, in that original edible slide, I put one on there that had a California product label. And that's because marijuana is illegal federally. You can't interstate transport. And therefore, if you're going to make stuff, all these Colorado manufacturers, if they want to come to California, they have to open up a factory. They have to produce their product in California for it to be legal. So you're going to have to familiarize yourself with things. But drinks are really fascinating. Okay? So these two drinks on the left are a couple that are manufactured in Colorado. Now, I don't like the endless comparisons to marijuana and alcohol. They are different and distinct. They have different features to them. But if somebody goes out and has a beer tonight and has a 12-ounce beer, how many serving sizes are in that beer? One, typically. One of the things that we encountered back home is this one on the left is 10 ounces. It has 10 serving sizes in it. The one on the right was 8.5 ounces and had 17 servings in it. So the little caps on the top of them were like the NyQuil bottle. And you measured that thing off. Now, you know, there are rules and regulations that have been promulgated in California that are meant to address some of these things. But like I said, part of it's an education piece. And I know we have the new rules that are getting rolled out, so I'm using some photographs from Colorado, but generally speaking, the recommended serving size is 10 milligrams. But again, products, you know, can you have overdoses? You can. You can have people who have bad experiences and emergency room visits as a result of it. But there's some things that go into it. And I know that even on the environmental health piece, what goes into the product themselves is something, and that's something that the industry has to cope with as well, because, you know, growing the plants and producing product that is healthy for the consumers becomes one of the big challenges. And in theory, the onus is going to be on the state. But because local governments have the ability to license and approve, typically the way it works is the state sets the floor, but local governments can have higher standards. And that becomes an important piece to consider. And you can get weighed very heavily in, you know, all the different chemicals and pesticides and everything that you need to consider and ban and everything like that. Because ultimately we are introducing a new product, that consumers are going to use, and you want to be able to have them use it, you know, in a healthy way. This one is always intriguing to me, is THC percentages or concentrations. Of course, Prop 64 enables laboratories to test for this stuff. The fascinating things I find with the laboratories is that usually historical laboratories won't touch this. And the reason they won't touch it is because they have a DEA license, and bad things will happen to their laboratory if they test this stuff. So most of your testing laboratories are going to be upstarts. And one of the things, if you know anything about testing, is when you test things scientifically, you typically have what's called an assayed sample. It is a known sample of the thing that you were looking for. Well, when marijuana is illegal, you can't obtain plant-based assayed samples of marijuana to test for potency. So even though we're going to have rules and regulations and requirements that insist that we test for this stuff and we want accuracy, there's not necessarily a way for the state to prove it. Now, you can tell me otherwise. And so these are just some of the challenges that go along with that. You know, when we talk about some of the challenges going forward, yes, you can possess an ounce or 8 ounces of concentrate. I know one of the challenges for law enforcement is how much is an ounce? Now, I know for a lot of cannabis users, they're just out to get us. They're out to get us. No, I teach cops all over the country about this stuff, and this stuff can be intimidating. Most cops can't visually identify an ounce, things like that. So large amounts can typically go by the wayside because they're like, I'm not really sure here. You can cultivate, you know, your 6 plants, and then we have these provisions in California that it's 6 plants per person over 21, up to 12 plants, you know, per residence. I think that's a good thing. In Colorado, we have an assist provision that says you can help your friends grow, and there's no cap on how many you can grow for. I think that causes problems and some fits for local government. One of the big pieces, though, is it allows for outdoor grows. And I know that what Prop 64 allows for is local governments to say no outdoor grows. And I think that's a big challenge. I think to solve the headache of upset neighbors, it's probably better to enact that ban and say you can grow inside but not outside, to save yourself a little bit of that headache. But that's an important part of it. The other part is you can keep your yield, so you can keep as much of it. And so it presents a lot of challenges. It's meant to be pretty straightforward. I know it taxes law enforcement. And the theory is they're going to have better time. They're going to now have time to do other things. Like, that's how it gets advertised. But usually it's these small things that causes them fits. And so they end up spending and doing more work on marijuana-related things than they did before, which is a bit ironic. Now, the one thing that I would hold out there is on medical. Medical's not going to go away. And I have to tell you, as a lawyer who studies and looks at this stuff, and I've looked at the California law extensively, medical's not going to go away, but the medical law, which for 20 years went largely untouched, and then in 2015, the state tried to promulgate these rules to get it under state control. What's kind of gotten swept under the rug is what's going to be the difficulty on the medical side. Because as we're sitting here trying to juggle and deal with, the recreational side, what's missed in all of this is what amount is too much under medical? And the answer is there isn't. A doctor can recommend as much as they want. Furthermore, the state has gone away from having a card system where medical marijuana people are supposed to have a card. Instead, all they have to have is a referral for their doctor. So from an enforcement standpoint, or just trying to get your hands wrapped around this stuff, it's very difficult. This is how it was set up originally, in Prop 64. From a lawyer, I look at this and say, who here knows what a mature plant looks like? Okay? Well, you guys know as growers, but from a legal standpoint, what does a mature plant look like? Flowering. Who here on the regulatory side knows what a flowering marijuana plant looks like? Okay, well, you're not on the regulatory side. You're the private lawyer. Okay? So there can be some challenges in all of this. And I got to tell you guys, one of the things is, initially, I know some people, especially on the advocacy side, are like, well, this is great. I don't really care. But you know who is going to care? The marijuana industry is going to care. The licensed people who have to pay taxes they're the ones back home in Colorado who are starting to complain about home grows. Because they're like, we have to abide by all the rules. What about all these people? And so it presents some interesting conflicts and challenges. I don't know how much I could go on forever. I don't know what all I should talk about. How about this one? Can't smoke in a public place. All right. Consumption becomes a big deal. And so if we look at the definition that says where you can't smoke, you can't go smoke in the city park, or you can't go walk along the main street and do something like that. But can you smoke on your front porch? Can you smoke on your back patio? If you live in an apartment, can you smoke on your balcony? It doesn't address that. But that's where the neighbors are going to call the cops, and the cops are going to be like, I got nothing. So I can tell you from my experience back home, that falls on local government. So Supervisor Miley sorting that out becomes a big deal for the county commissioners in all of this. I am from Golden, Colorado. This is how my local government chose to do it. They just banned the hell out of everything outdoors. Probably the simple and easy way. So this is a sign that is frequently posted in my community. You can't vape, you can't smoke, you can't do anything. I suppose that solves the problem. The interesting evolution, of course, in the politics of marijuana is permission for this. And in my state, this wasn't originally considered, but in all 4 states that passed in 2016, California, Nevada, Massachusetts, and Maine, there were provisions to permit for cannabis clubs. And look, I know people on the marijuana side who, they have a mantra, and they're in this room, it's like, treat it like alcohol. All right? Treat it like alcohol. I want to go out, have my substance of choice with my friends. And they've obtained a lot in terms of legal equality. They're looking for cultural equality. And it's not going to stop until cultural equality, until there's assimilation. But this in itself is going to present some problems too. In alcohol, we have tips training. Are we going to have tips training for our bud tenders and our people who ultimately work in this, to assess these kind of things? We talked about some of the crimes, things like that. This is the one I always find interesting, this is meant to disrupt the black market. There's a really cool thing you guys can do if you want to test the black market, because California has this provision that says you can donate, you can basically give away your marijuana up to an ounce. So if you ever want to test the black market, just go to Craigslist and plug in the word marijuana and donations, and you'll instantly find the black market. That's where it exists. It's kind of a shell game. So basically it's like they call it a donation. There's definitely a cost involved. But there's the black market right there in plain view. I actually use that to determine what the black market rate for marijuana is. So the businesses might want to do that too. So when we talk about these things, oh God, there's a lot of factors and considerations above and beyond just the licensing that goes into this stuff. I will tell you the cultivation stuff becomes really challenging in terms of, we talked about the ability to ban. Can local governments cap? Well, at 12 plants, but can you institute other things, other policies? Can you require things concerning discharge, water, electricity, use like that at a local government level? Those are some big challenges to all of that stuff. It has to be fully enclosed and secure. That's going to raise another question. What does that look like? Because growers a lot of times love to have to be able to control the environment. That's better for their plants, but they also like the power of the sun because electricity is really stinking expensive. And so you'll often look for hybrid structures and things like that. So that can definitely tax and go away. So open container is one that I see as being very problematic in California, and that is because you have conflicting statutes. Prop 64 sort of laid out what the open container violation would be, and really what it suggests is that when traveling with your marijuana, and this was one of the questions from the reporters, what is lawful? And basically what it's saying is, you know, when people go into dispensaries and buy stores, by regulation, they're commonly going to come out in containers like these. The way it's set up in Prop 64 is if you are traveling with this in your car and somehow part of the product is out of the bag and laying on the seat or something, that might be an open container violation. The problem is that you have had this statute on the books for years, which is just any travel of marijuana under an ounce is a crime. And this is going to be problematic, and I think it's challenging for California law enforcement because they now have conflicting laws as to which one they enforce. I heard back down in LA there's an informal, well, it goes in your trunk. Well, that's not what the law says. And so this one is one that I think that the state legislature is going to have to sort out. And then this is really my area of expertise, is the marijuana impaired driving question. So yes, it's illegal, but what does it all mean? It's going to be a challenge for the police officers, in part because there's no, one of the reporters was asking about, you know, toxicological standards, and the way the science has evolved in this place is that really the toxicologists are starting to say there's not a good number. Now, occasionally, depending on the level of that number, they will. So, to oversimplify it, the traditional methods that we use for alcohol may not be the best methodology for detecting, investigating marijuana impaired driving. And so that also is, you know, in looking at what we commonly would take in California, if somebody was arrested for this and charged, in their blood we're looking for what's called delta-9 THC, which is the active impairing ingredient in marijuana. The problem is it's very ephemeral. It doesn't stay in the body for very long. So there are a lot of scientific challenges in the marijuana world too. Scientists are looking for different ways and trying to tear apart this plant and discover it, but because the federal prohibitions, it's very, very limited. If you want to study marijuana, the only way you can do it is to go get your federally approved University of Mississippi ditchweed, and try and research with that, and it's very problematic. So a lot of these scientific questions that we are trying to answer concerning all of this are going to have to be put on the back burner as we wait for the feds to do something about it. So some other things was the employment piece, and I think this is just smart politics. They knew they couldn't get it passed unless the employers were given deference. So employers have pretty much absolute discretion over the marijuana issue. They can test people, they can do all that. There's been litigation in Colorado, and we had a similar provision in our law, and it was pretty much sustained by our courts, and it said it deferred to the employers. Employers have discretion. Now, that might be dismaying to people because they can still lose their job over it, but that's the state of the law. Private property owners have discretion too. So landlords have discretion. They can say whether it comes, goes, things like that. So anyways, it was a lot. Sorry. Any questions?
Yeah, he covered a lot of material in a short time. So questions. We have time for maybe 5 minutes of questions before we move to the next panelist, and then what I said, we'll circle back around. Yeah.
Hi, Dale Gieringer with California NORML. Just a quick correction. The vehicle code contradiction concerning open containers at VC 23222 has been fixed.
Okay.
And there's now a good definition of open containers is any container that's basically been opened or the seal has been broken on it, or else you can put it in your trunk.
Great. Thank you, Dale.
Hello.
Hello.
I'm Tony Rossi. I wanted to know how much is or was in the typical marijuana joint of the past. How much compared to what you're saying, like 10 milligrams or 10 micrograms?
Well, when we're talking about milligrams, we're talking about a weight measurement. When we're talking about potency or concentration, we're talking about a percentage thereof.
Of the THC, like...
So historically, when they're talking about THC, you know, older, 10, 20, 30 years ago, it was probably under 10% for your bud flower. But now you're going to average...
So would that be like 50 milligrams or 100?
Not necessarily. I mean, your average joint is a gram. But in terms of the weight measurement, I can't answer that question.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Hi, my name is David Silverman. I actually want to touch on something Mr. Turner mentioned earlier. Colorado does have a banking system for marijuana that's state ran, correct?
No.
No.
So here's the issue. They tried.
Yeah.
Their legislature tried to go through the credit union system in order to create a state credit union that marijuana businesses could use. The legislature supported it ultimately and never passed. So obviously that's the big dilemma. What I know on the banking side is there are a few banks out there who will take deposits. In essence, though, their federal rules require them to declare it drug money and report it to the feds. That's really the way it works. Some, I think, take the assumption that the feds aren't going to do anything about it, so they do that. While a lot of businesses in Colorado started all cash and some are still cash, a lot of businesses have figured out some really crafty workarounds.
Are you familiar with any of those?
There are some. One of the most prominent dispensaries in Colorado, I think they have no less than 12 stores. When you run a credit card at their store, it comes back as a limousine company. So there are some workarounds. A lot of businesses are taking credit cards. It is not to say, though, that there aren't a lot of businesses who have giant safes, who pay everything, including their taxes and their payroll in cash, who are likely targets for burgs and rips.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
And
we can talk more.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. Thank you.
Anybody else at the moment? Okay. Our next speaker is Rob RAICH.
Thank you, Supervisor Miley. I'm glad to be with you this morning, this afternoon. I want to talk about a few specific issues which I think will be useful for those of you here in this room today. First, I want to let you know how I got my start as a cannabis attorney. You know, the reason I got into this in the first place is human rights issues. I feel that you as American citizens, actually as you as a human being, have a right to put into your body what you want to. You have the right to think the thoughts that you want to, and that's your business, not the government's business. And when it comes to cannabis, that was the most obvious factor. This is a herb that's been around for millions of years. Human beings have used it for at least thousands of years. And for that to be something that the government says is not only illegal, but really illegal, just doesn't make sense. So I was happy to become involved the way to try to remove some of that injustice in our society. In particular, medical cannabis was the sharp point of that spear trying to end that injustice, because clearly medical cannabis patients who need access to their medicine have a real compelling need for it. As a lawyer who left a firm to be my own sole practice, I was able to take on issues that were controversial. Cannabis was controversial, and it was just a wonderful eye-opening experience for me to be able to do work where some partner in the firm was not telling me no, I couldn't do it, and actually having a beneficial effect on trying to end some of the injustice and human rights violations that exist in America. In California, in 1996, we passed Proposition 215 that legalized medical cannabis. Now, a lot of people think that's when medical cannabis really began in California, but really there was a whole lot that was going on before that even happened. You know, Proposition 215 never emerged like Athena bursting fully grown from the head of Zeus. There were three resolutions that the legislature passed. One resolution, two statutes, both of which were vetoed by the governor. So we realized we had to go to the voters with an initiative that was then passed. And in Alameda County, the percentage that passed it was really extreme. Alameda County was the fourth county where the largest percentage of voters supported Proposition 215, behind only San Francisco, Santa Cruz County, and Marin County. The voters in Alameda County are pretty intelligent in that regard, and I was happy to be here to help with shepherding that through. In Alameda County, we have approached this in a fairly reasonable way. There were a number of dispensaries at one time that existed in Alameda County, mainly in the Supervisor Miley's district. The supervisors decided they would limit the number of those dispensaries to 3, and then the federal government came in and prosecuted the people involved with one of them, so the number reduced to 2, and it's still 2 to this day. However, the Board of Supervisors just about a month ago passed an ordinance to increase that number and allow cultivation to take place as well. And I'm happy to say that just yesterday, in the wisdom of our Board of Supervisors, they said that as of January 1st, any of the existing dispensaries will be able to be involved with adult use in not just medical cannabis. Yes, that's a great, terrific benefit to all of us. We have thanks that we owe to our Board of Supervisors for their wisdom in that. Now, in Alameda County, that's just the beginning, just the increase in the number of dispensaries and the cultivation that will be taking place. That was phase 1. In phase 2 that we'll be seeing in the coming months, the Board of Supervisors will be considering other ordinances to allow other types of cannabis activity, presumably both adult use and medical, that will be taking place in the county. So we don't miss out on this wonderful new industry that's emerging and let other jurisdictions take that instead. So this approach in Alameda County has been careful but wise. We have good, wise elected officials in Alameda County. The trends in California with respect to adult use are also showing a good approach. You saw the 3 major regulators here this morning who all seem to be fairly dedicated to trying to meet the needs of both consumers as well as the voters and the legislature. And that I think we'll see a system that actually works here in California, or at least reasonably well, as opposed to the system we've seen in various other states where medical cannabis is allowed, and for whatever reason, the politicians are only trying to thwart it from being affected. So I think that we will see California, as it ought to be, leading the way in good cannabis policies for the rest of the country to use. And we got a little behind the curve that some other states like Colorado, Washington State got ahead of us with adult use. And we will be now, I think, reasserting our position in coming years. Now, when it came for the voters in their wisdom passing Proposition 64, 13 months ago, in November of 2016, again, the voters in Alameda County supported it by the 4th highest percentage of any county in California. Actually, in the 20 intervening years between the time we passed Proposition 215 and Proposition 64, the percentage of voters supporting legal cannabis actually increased for adult use as opposed to merely medical 20 years prior. A year ago, Alameda County voters supported Prop 64 by 66.5%. I think that tells us what the voters, the residents of Alameda County want. And again, we were only behind San Francisco, Santa Cruz, and Marin County in terms of the percentages. A little bit edged us out, but the other 58 counties in California did not recognize the wisdom of legal adult use cannabis as much as Alameda County did. So it only makes sense that we should be there to have a thriving cannabis industry here in Alameda County. So some of the changes since full adult use legalization, if you will, happened. We can look at Colorado and see some of the benefits they have. Some of the things we're talking about this afternoon have to do with teen use of cannabis. What we saw in Colorado after they legalized adult use cannabis was a drop. And it's the 1 year from the time before it was legal until it wasn't, a drop in teen use by 2.5%. These numbers come from the federal government themselves, by the way. Didn't want to have anything that was questionable. Teen use dropped by 2.5% in Colorado by legalizing medical cannabis. On the other hand, nationwide, there was also a little drop for teen use, only dropped by 0.4% versus 2.5%. Big difference. This is not too surprising when you think about it. You don't need to be a psychologist to know if you tell a person you shall not do something, that is the one thing a person is going to try to specifically do, especially if they are rebellious adolescent. So you make it something legal that, your mom and dad or your adults can legally do. That doesn't really let you have that attitude of being a rebel that you think you are as an adolescent. And in this benefit, I think that we've seen various places where cannabis is legal for adult use or even medically, that teen use does tend to go down. So we're doing it right. If we want to keep cannabis away from youth, legalizing is a good approach, and historically we've been able to see that. Some of the people on the other side are still promoting this reefer madness idea, but I think we can dispel some of those rumors from the fact looking at this. The regulations, have been working fair enough to satisfy everybody. Here in California, really, we didn't have too vigorous regulations until January 1st of next year, when they'll really kick in. However, we weren't seeing that the sky was falling, even just with the regulations that we had under Proposition 215 or SB 420, passed by the legislature in 2003, which set up the collective or cooperative approach that pretty much everybody is right now who's a legal medical cannabis industry activist will be, as a collective or cooperative. Although starting next year, you get a state license, which really does make you legal. What we can do to encourage people to be responsible consumers is awareness campaigns to teach people what they should do and the kinds of cannabis they should use, the ways and the locations, not just for use, but also for people in the industry as well. And those of us in the industry can help out by making sure people up and down the supply chain are responsible. Now, I'm a cannabis attorney, as you know. I have clients in all phases of the industry. The clients come in all shapes and forms. Some of them are little mom or pop operations. Some are medium-sized. Some are people who are relatively big. All of them. California, to their credit, does not limit you to only being a California resident. You can be a person from another state or even another country and still be involved in the cannabis industry. We didn't want to limit whatever wisdom, knowledge, experience, money they may have to help us emerge as an industry here in California. And in particular, people have been incarcerated for marijuana prohibition violations. Ruins their life, ruins the communities, their families. They can now participate in general in this new economy. There are some limits. If you're a person who's been involved with violent crime, that might be a factor. If you were involved in dishonesty crimes, such as fraud or avoiding taxes. You know, the state wants to get its taxes from these things. But if it's just for a marijuana violation, you may need to disclose this in order to get your state license. But it's not alone a exclusionary factor. Some of the other things that are happening are a little bit kind of interesting. Some of the diversity and inclusion issues that people have been thinking about. We have this new industry, so here we can end some of the other injustice that the war on drugs, the failed war on drugs, has been involved with. We could talk all afternoon about some of the history of cannabis and the reason that it was made illegal in the first place. You know, the first laws about cannabis in what's now the United States were some of the colonies that were part of England were required to grow cannabis. That was the first laws in cannabis. Those people would be shocked to find out that a few centuries later, that same herb they were familiar with, which was called hemp or cannabis, would be illegal. Illegal because they had to invent a new word called marijuana. The whole reason that's illegal is racist, from the beginning to the end. The very first states that made cannabis illegal were doing it because they were trying to create downtrodden people who were Asian, who were Mexican, who were African American, or a few other odd places, jazz musicians. That was the reason. That was where the propaganda was coming from. And about 100 years ago, when that was beginning, certain states that made cannabis illegal. When it became illegal at the federal level, which is about 8 decades ago, the same kinds of racism was promoted. And you can just look at some of the news reports, you know, newspapers that were being put out, then you just cringe at some of the blatant racism that they were promoting in some of those things. When the Marijuana Tax Act, 1937, was declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court in 1969, under Richard Nixon, they passed the Federal Controlled Substances Act, 1970, which is what we're still living under today federally. Same thing. They couldn't quite come on out by 1970 and be blatantly racist, but it was, again, blatantly racist. Again, people of color were the victimized, and then a few other people then. People who were Richard Nixon's enemies on his enemies list, particularly Vietnam War protesters, hippies, and again, African Americans in particular, to create that school to prison pipeline to ruin their lives. So with these people now, we have an issue where it's been illegal. We're now making it illegal. Some places want to create some benefit to people who've been victimized by the war on drugs all of this time. And the city of Oakland was one of the first places to do that by promoting certain benefits to people who had equity. And the word equity has taken a different meaning in this. Some other cities and counties are following along. San Francisco, Los Angeles, et cetera. What I'd just like to take the time to mention to you is if you're going to promote some kind of diversity or inclusion for people who've been victimized by the war on drugs, don't follow Oakland's example, all right? If you were to fly in from Mars and look at what we've got, you would think that the system was designed to thwart the cannabis industry and not really create any equity in the process under the rhetoric of equity. There are other ways of doing it to really benefit people who've been victimized by the war on drugs. However, Oakland's specific policy probably does not achieve that goal. Counties can have rules, create tax revenue, create safe access. That's really what we're talking about for patients and adults who want access to this. This is what we're talking about, adults, not children. Nobody really in the industry is talking about children anyway for this. You will provide additional revenue, money that's useful for other good needs we've got here in this county and in cities, for law enforcement, for public safety programs, for education, other real benefits that this new source of money in a legal industry can create, making new jobs, new careers for people in this industry, and not just the industry itself, but for ancillary occupations, providing benefits to people in the industry. And when we do that, that money is staying right here in the industry, in the community. It's not going someplace else. If you buy, food made by Monsanto or someplace, it doesn't stay in the city, in the community so much. We can create jobs and those careers right here in our community that will stay here with all the benefits for those of us who are in this community. You can look in various places, found a good report saying that by 2020, barely 2 or 3 years from now, they think the legal cannabis market will create more than 250,000 jobs. I mean, you think about something that will be really significant to benefit our economy. Legalizing cannabis is a perfect excuse. It will create more jobs than manufacturing, than utilities, even than government jobs we created by a legal cannabis industry, again, according to a federal government agency. I realized some of these jobs we're talking about are not just here out there in the farm where cultivation is taking place, but up and down the whole supply chain of cannabis as a useful service. And also, again, people in those ancillary services. Back in 1849, when we had a gold rush in California, a lot of the people who made money weren't the miners. It was the people who were involved in banking, like a bank that's now known as the Bank of America started then. Levi Strauss making jeans. The people who made picks and shovels. Those are the people who made a whole lot of money. And some of those companies are still around today providing ancillary services to the miners. We can do that as well. And then other industries we haven't even thought of in the cannabis industry. California, to its credit, is not limiting just the types of cannabis businesses they can be. Yeah, you have to have a certain type of license, but some other places are just ossifying and saying this is the only types of cannabis businesses you can have. We can see any number of cannabis businesses that are limited only by the human imagination. So if we wisely decide to embrace these opportunities, we can embrace all of these benefits in this new green economy to the benefit of the citizens as well as to the whole community as well. This is a perfect opportunity that eliminating individual human rights violations can help the community and our industry as well.
Okay. Thank you, Robert. So that brings us right up to our time frame for our next speaker, Susan FANELLI, and then we'll see if we have time for questions after that.
Absolutely. Good afternoon. I'm Susan FANELLI. I'm the Assistant Director for the California Department of Public Health. And being a public health person, we live and die by data. And so what we really want to understand is, where are we today in terms of marijuana use? Where are we in terms of the data about who's using, what they're using, how they're using, and really understand that data. So we were awarded we weren't actually awarded. The Department of Healthcare Services was awarded $5 million under Prop 64 for a public health or public education campaign, largely around youth, the risks to youth, as well as making sure that we did have Office of Traffic Safety and some information about what it means related to driving. So under Prop 64, we had to look at what's legal. Our job in creating a public information campaign, we were awarded $4 million out of the $5 million from Department of Healthcare Services to put together a campaign starting September 1st, which was very short since we got the money in about April or May, trying to get a public information campaign up and running in a couple of months through state contracting processes and everything else is pretty amazing. But we really wanted to look at how do we promote safe and responsible use? How do we indicate what the risks are to youth and pregnant and breastfeeding women? And then how do we make sure people really understand what is legal and what are the penalties if you do things that are not legal? And so we do have our website up and running. We have fact sheets on all of those things available at Let's Talk Cannabis, CA.gov or CA.com, or on our website at cdph.ca.gov, and so you can get to it either way. We really wanted to, in order to really do an effective public information campaign, as I said before, you really have to understand what is the information that you need to take into account. How do you look at what's happening from risk and protective factors? What are the attitudes, beliefs, perception? What kind of marketing is out there? And so what exists today versus what might exist in the future. Looking at patterns of consumption, most of the information we have right now is self-reported use because it's not been legal other than medicinal. And so what we are looking at are survey data that really look at asking people how much they've used, and still very interesting information. Sales, we have had a medicinal market now for some time. Number and location of retail outlets, we know that we have projections on all of that. We've looked at Colorado data. We've looked at other data to try and make projections about what that will look like in California. And then we really want to look at consequences and outcomes, particularly looking at, poisonings, physical health, child welfare, all of those things that, we want to see the data. We want to be sure we're collecting the data, that we have a good surveillance structure to collect that data. And I really hope that you are correct and that numbers go down for youth.
Statistically, they do.
And so looking at youth risk behavior survey, looking at the California Student Tobacco Survey, California Healthy Kids. So we do have some baseline data in California, and we can start there in terms of, as we see it become legal, what does change? And if it goes down, or we would be extremely happy. Our job in public health really is to keep it away from youth and pregnant and breastfeeding women. That is sort of our goal in terms of this, and to make sure that in the process we educate people about safe and responsible use and keeping it out of the hands of kids and pets. So we just did some data mining to sort of look at what do we know today. And so this first one is looks at Californians 12 or older and how much they use among age 12 or older from the period of 2010 to 2015. And so you will see, 12 to 17 is in the blue, 18 to 25 is in the orange, and 26 and over is in the green. And you will see the primary target audience in California is 18 to 25, who are the most likely to use. We looked at adults 18 and over and how much they use. And so not only did we ask if you use, but we asked how many times in the last month, how many days did you use? And you can see sort of the numbers here of 18 to 20 and 21, and the number of people above 40% who use 20 or more days in a month. So we also wanted to look, because we are most concerned about youth, we wanted to look at 7th, 9th, 11th graders, using the data to say how are people and when are they starting to use. And so, most concerning obviously is the young people, 5% of seventh graders that might be using. And so how do we make sure that we understand these numbers and continue to track them? Self-reported use of cannabis during pregnancy, keeping our eye on that as well. We have been talking to people about why they use, how they use, when they use, and trying to better understand that and to see if there are options or alternatives for pregnant and breastfeeding women who may have needs for something to assist with medical needs or anxiety or a whole host of other things. So phase one really was getting our website up and running. We relied on the National Academy of Sciences report heavily in terms of what they found. And as folks have alluded to here, there's not been good scientific research because you are limited in what marijuana you can use, even if you do get ability to do a research project. And so what we looked at was what could we say was at least significant evidence under the National Academy of Science report. Because if any of you have read the report, one, it is long. Two, it is sort of all over the place with a lot of things that there's just not conclusive evidence. And so we want to make sure as public health, we are science-based and we are looking at the things that have a preponderance of evidence and that have really shown that there is significant correlation. So phase one is really about just what's legal. It is meant for a broad audience. We are, in fact, today I was working on our animated video that is going to come out at the end of the year. Colorado has one, Alaska has one. We've seen in a very quick, 60, 70 seconds, how do you tell people what's legal? In a way that really can resonate and in a quick way give people a lot of information. And I would never have imagined how hard it is to create a 60 to 70 second video in terms of getting it right, getting the law right, getting the diversity right, getting the language right. Today we were a little worried it was a little too upbeat, like how do you convey seriousness but also convey that, this is a serious issue, but it's not reefer madness and it's not so that balance of how do you convey all of that is challenging. And so we want people to, understand what the law is, to understand what, what the risks may be associated with it as well. We looked at why people, public health does formative research. We do focus groups. We do a lot of testing of why are people using, and particularly as we focus on youth and pregnant and breastfeeding women, if we're going to change attitudes around when and how you use it, we need to understand why people are using it. Phase two, we are doing more in-depth research and really looking at that more in terms of focus groups that are made up of youth and made up of pregnant and breastfeeding women who really talk more in detail and explain why and how and what the norms are, where they come from, how it's used. And I think I've been impressed with some of the sophistication of some of the people we've talked about. And it's all over the board in terms of how much information they know and don't know. And so we are trying to come up with creative messaging for those folks that we are really trying to most at risk for use during youth or during pregnancy or breastfeeding. And so we are trying to work on a process that will allow us to identify who those at-risk youth are across the state and target messaging in a way that will resonate with them. And again, the message being sort of, it's legal when you're 21 and there are reasons for that. Your brain is still developing. There are reasons why you might want to wait. So our issues really are around, again, looking at the normalization, making sure it stays in the adult phase, adult marketplace, not with youth. Edibles, concentration, dosing, making sure that the variety of products and methods that are out there are safe. We do the manufacturing piece in our department, and we do want to make sure that we've learned some lessons from other states who came before us in terms of what the products should look like, how they should be packaged, what kinds of logos we should have on things to make sure people understand that the product contains THC. We're working with the Office of Traffic Safety to make sure that we have access to their messaging as we look at, what is the test in terms of impaired driving? What does that look like? And as we continue to work with their campaign, we'll link to theirs and they will link to ours. Really understanding the long-term effects, the lack of research, and setting a research agenda, and working with Prop 64 also puts dollars in for research from some of our academic institutions. So making sure we are working with them to get the information that we need as a state to understand use and products and sort of how we move from where we are today as it becomes legal. What are the things we should be tracking? And looking at things like indoor smoke, secondhand smoke, some of those issues that we will continue to look at from a public health perspective.
All right, thank you. So we have about 5 minutes or so for questions of any of these panelists.
Come on up to the mic. Just come up to the mic.
Good afternoon, and thank you. Thank you for your testimony and presentation. I just wanted to say, just briefly, I was composing my thoughts. I do want to thank you, Mr. RAICH, for pointing out the historical nature, first and foremost, of the word even itself, marijuana, in being pejorative. And in recognizing it as cannabis, in which it's being recognized now. With that, I wanted to say language is important. It's hugely important, and thank you for acknowledging that in your presentation as well. But if we're going to change our perception of the legalization of both the industry, the product, the plant, and even those who now consume cannabis, CBD, or derivatives thereof, I think language matters. And with such, I would say for like adult consumers and those who enjoy cannabis and cannabis-based products, we might want to be mindful of that. I don't think moving forward, we do need a new language, a new word. I don't think people see themselves anymore as users. That was tied to drug use and calling people druggies or drug users. We don't call a person who receives pain medication as a user. We don't call the pregnant woman who receives certain forms of ongoing medication a user. They're called patients. And it's not just from a compassionate standpoint, but it's a perception. And I think perhaps maybe if our public institutions in the state might want to look at a different word that might more applicable, whether it's from a medical standpoint, people are called patients and referred to as patients, and that might be a little more apropos. And even if it's on the not entertainment side, excuse me. Help me. Recreational. Thank you, everyone. It's that day. It's that day. Haven't had a coffee yet. But on the recreational side, again, I think consumer is more appropriate when it comes down to product consumption, food consumption or otherwise, or even tobacco consumption would be more appropriate. So thank you.
I have a quick question. Robert mentioned basically the new economy and how Levi Strauss, Bank of America, and other entities came out of the gold rush. So my question is really to Richard. Is there anybody in this business, especially in Colorado, that is publicly traded and able to basically be in the business?
I am peripherally familiar that there are definitely cannabis companies that are publicly traded. I'm not too terribly familiar on what markets there are. I think there was sort of this was 2 or 3 years ago, there was a lot of interest in Fury. I don't think that a lot of the publicly traded cannabis companies are doing wildly well. I think a lot of companies are retaining their private equity and doing quite well that way. There is how they're doing it, because clearly financial rules and things like that are federally governed, but I mean, if you look it up, Google it, I'm sure you can find some that are publicly traded.
That is my question, because since it is the SEC, they are a federal agency. I'm just wondering, can you raise capital through the markets, through them, in order to fund your business?
I can't answer that question, but I know some people some attorneys on the cannabis side, and Rich might be able to answer that better than I can.
All right, thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Nathan Hobbs. I'm the interim alcohol and drug administrator for Alameda County, and I'm particularly concerned about marijuana or cannabis use among youth. I can tell you that in the treatment programs that I oversee that are dedicated to treating adolescents, we have seen over the past couple of years an increase in those who indicate their primary drug of choice is marijuana. I want to pair that with what I see on the streets and billboards around our county, which is a lot of advertising around schools, for example, and billboards. And so I'm concerned about a culture that is really normalizing this among youth. I don't see increases in prevention dollars to educate our youth around the dangers of this. And so I'm putting this out there and wanting to ask you all about, the policy implications of this for youth. Thank you.
Sure. Be happy to address some of that. The good news for you is once the licenses get issued by the state effective January 1st of next year, there will be a source of money that will be available at the state level to fund some of these very education programs that you are talking about. Also, I think that what you'll see once legalization really kicks in, again, starting January of next year, you'll see in all likelihood the allure to youth will be reduced, and you're likely to see if fewer youth are being involved with cannabis. Nevertheless, as a parent, I'd have to say, if I had a child who's going to be drinking alcohol or consuming cannabis, I wouldn't want them doing either, but if they have the choice between the two, cannabis would be a better choice than alcohol.
And that's where I'm going to part ways. And this is one of my concerns about this, is that we get into this like, let's pick one. And to me, they are both substances. They have impairing qualities. They impair differently. And I've seen the SAMHSA data. I have seen the Healthy Kids Survey data. I can't quibble with it because some of the numbers are flat. And yet anecdotally, I definitely hear from not only parents, school resource officers, things like that marijuana is much easier to get a hold of than alcohol. And I'll tell you something a little more fundamental, and this is my concern when it comes to youth use. And it's bare bone basics. When I have parents my age, and I have 3 kids who talk about marijuana use, and they might even be, legitimate recreational consumers that are like, I don't want my kids to do it. Frontal lobe brain development, wait until you're 25. All the things that go along with that. I will tell you what my concern is that people my age think their kids are going to start smoking joints, and they're not. Edibles and concentrates are far easier to conceal. And so what we're seeing is kids are starting off with high potency THC. That's the starter kit. That's what I think is going to be the issue. Is, now we have kids who might be starting out 70, 80, 90% THC. We have no idea what the long-term effects are of, that high of THC on an adult brain. We certainly don't know what it is on a juvenile brain. If we're looking to address those factors, I think that's one of the long-term health concerns that comes with legalization.
And last thing I'll add is that our own county, through public health, did a very effective campaign around advertising tobacco use towards youth, and very effectively done. And we've taken the blueprint and trying to craft a similar, maybe it's through an ordinance or through the city council passing ordinances about, even though the law says that you cannot target to youth, there's that generic law, and then there's more targeted law that can happen at the local level just to deter any kind of advertising that might be attractive to or be attracting young people to become consumers. And I think that's also another way of being able to use our public dollars, either through public health or through other ways, to be able to not have that be so easy for the advertisers.
Yeah. And I would just say, you're a county employee?
Yes.
Are you on our internal county working group?
I'm not on your.
Okay. But you work for the Behavioral Health Department?
I do.
Okay, and Eileen Ng is the policy director. So I think you should get hooked up with our internal county working group, because the next panel is going to talk just what you've been asking about. We have a whole cannabis education and adult awareness committee that's looking at just what you're talking about to try to address those concerns. We might not be able to control what cities do like in Oakland, but in terms of Alameda County, we are definitely focused in on trying to make sure there's any of our permittees are going to be required to put back into a community benefit type approach at helping to address that level of awareness and education. And as the district attorney pointed out, we'll be doing other things as well. So I think we need to get you on our working group so you can be more informed and also help to inform our direction as we move forward. Thank you. All right, two more quick questions. Oh, sorry.
I do think you're correct in saying that there's not money for public education. And we have one-time money in our department. There is some money under Prop 64, a whole list of things that may come, such as youth treatment programs, but we don't know what those dollars look like or how soon they would come out.
Okay, so two more quick questions. And I appreciate the question because just one other quick thing. We want to make sure we learn from the alcohol industry and the tobacco industry and the mistakes that were made relative to those substances as they relate to how young people were targeted. So and other communities were targeted. So we really want to address that ahead of time. But keep in mind, everything we do doesn't necessarily mean that there won't be abuses. But we need to try to see how we can minimize that. And the next panel is going to talk probably more about that as well. So two more individuals, then I want to move to the next panel.
Hi, my name is Miranda Henry from the NAACP. Just a quick question to any of the panelists. Since we're talking about the cannabis business, do you think that a public bank is more liable and more resourceful for the business? If so, how soon do you think that cities will be able to see a public bank in their cities?
I think it would be a great idea. As a practical matter, though, it does not seem to be a viable solution. As Chris mentioned, Colorado tried to adopt a credit union. There would be a state credit union. The problem is, as a credit union, you're a financial institution, you still need a certification from the Federal Reserve System. And their federal agency, they refused to grant it. They went to court. The court ruled against them. So it seems that there really is not yet a solution to what is one of the biggest problems for our industry nationwide, which is banking.
And when we do our summit this coming summer, that's going to be one of the focus, taxes and banking. So stay tuned.
Good afternoon. My name is Elsa Casanova. I have two quick questions. My first question is for Director FANELLI, and I think you may have already answered my question, but I must still ask. Do you know if there are going to be any funds coming down from the state for local jurisdictions to implement their own education and awareness efforts?
So right now Prop 64 does not provide that type of funding. Okay. Unlike tobacco control or something like that, where we have allocations to cities and counties, there is no money for that.
Okay.
We have one-time $4 million and no guarantee of any additional money.
Thank you. And then my second question is for TA Nancy O'Malley. Can you tell us what has been or what will be put in place in terms of enforcement against the black market?
Well, I mean, the law's pretty clear. It's a misdemeanor level crime. And so unless it's a minor who's it's either being sold to or given to a minor, then it can be a felony. We would handle it the way we have in other cases. The change that will occur, and we're still working through it, talking with our community, and that is that the last several years we have not really done strong enforcement of personal use or possession of marijuana. And so we're looking at it from a business perspective more than a drug use. And I appreciate the language comment that not looking at it as drug use, but rather a business industry. And whether that falls under consumer protection, which we have authority to take certain actions around that, or it's criminal, the misdemeanor, or Sometimes it might even involve environmental. So we're just looking at all of those resources and want to make sure that we're being appropriate, but at the same time, now that the laws have been put in place to legalize the cannabis industry, then we will treat it the way we do if you're selling untaxed or the cigarette packs without the tax stamp or some other bootleg or black market.
Okay. Chris, do you have any comments about how Colorado is dealing with the black market?
I'll do it on a break so I can get to the other panel.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, thanks for those questions, and like I said, we'll come back and see if we can have some more questions shortly. So the next panel is, are they going to be? You're going to be sitting here? Okay. So if you want to stay, you can stay, or you can. It's up to you. So the next panel is the Cannabis Education, Adult and Youth Awareness panel, and we have on that panel we have Judy APPEL, Dale Gieringer, Ralph Cantor, and Jennifer Ellis, and I think it's going to be a very informative panel. And so I think since they're leaving, why don't you guys come on up here and join me? That way people can see you, and I won't feel so lonely by myself. So come right along, because we are about 3 minutes behind. 3 minutes behind schedule.
They start there.
No, no.
3 o'clock. Thank you. You're welcome.
I'm going back this way. All right, so we're going to start off with Judy.
Great. Should I just go ahead?
Yes.
So good afternoon. I really commend all of you who stayed here throughout the whole day. And I really also want to thank the supervisor for having this summit and other summits, because this is such an important opportunity to really discuss all of the many issues that are coming out of the legalization of adult use. And so I was asked to speak on the youth panel, and I just wanted to make one correction. It says in the program that I work with the Drug Policy Alliance. I don't work for the Drug Policy Alliance anymore. I used to work there. I think I was kind of morphed from drug policy analyst to where I used to work. The place where I wanted to speak from is that I'm on the school board for Berkeley Unified School District, and I thought that actually that would probably be the most helpful perspective to bring here that would be unique given the other people on the board. So I am speaking as an individual board member, because not on behalf of the board, although I think what I'll say is really consistent with our district. I'm also a mother, so I have as of last week I had 2 teens. Now I have a 16-year-old and a 20-year-old. So I have a teen and a no longer teen. So the question of cannabis use is a very current one in our household, and I'm going to be honest to say that I'm not going to give specifics, but I'm just going to say that the issue came up last night in an active way, and we had a conversation about it. And so I was just sitting here in the audience, and I took a picture of the program, and I texted it to my family and said, "Guess where I'm speaking this afternoon?" And I got 2 SMHs from my teens. So I don't know if you know what that means, but like, oh, Mom, shake my head. So I'm definitely concerned about making sure that my kids are aware of the impact of using cannabis. And because I know that they have access, really ready access now, and have had to cannabis, for me the question is much more having them be informed and educated about the impact, and trying to have them reduce their use or not use at all. But I have found, and I think we have found this around other kinds of abstinence type programs that just say no doesn't work, right? Kids don't just say no because you tell them to say no. In fact, if you tell them to say no, a lot of times they look for the way to say yes. So I think one of the things that I think is really a great opportunity for us in this upcoming, as we're creating the path with adult use legalization, is given the fact that we have high levels of youth use, how do we use the fact that, first of all, we're going to have more money that's going to go into health education and treatment. How do we use that to impact as a school board member? I'm like, how do we use that to help strengthen our efforts in those areas in our school district? And then when we look to places like Washington and Colorado, we actually see, I mean, I think there's some debate about whether adolescent use has gone down or has remained flat, but I don't think anybody has seen an increase. And so we need to look at why that is. And I think that what I'd be really interested to see, not only in, if you look at like the Healthy Kids Survey data to see whether or not the amount of use has gone down, but also kind of the incidence of like accidental overuse or some of the emergency room visits. And my prediction is that will actually go down because it's a more regulated industry. For example, I know that in our high school this year, we've had some cases with edibles of kids taking too much and having to end up and getting brought to the hospital. And that is because they had no, I mean, obviously we don't condone that, but I'm just saying that the risk is greater when you're not regulated. So I actually anticipate a decrease in use and also a decrease in risk. I think, like I said, along with the decrease in risk for many kids, it could, I think for many kids that also diminishes some of the attraction. I did want to take just one more minute to talk a little bit about the school setting, because I noticed that in the previous speaker put up the data from the Healthy Kids Survey for the state, but I will say that particularly in this area, in Alameda County, but particularly like at Oakland and Berkeley, we have higher than average use amongst our youth, particularly our 11th graders. I think lifetime is hovers around 30-35%. And many have, if you ask them if they've used it in the last 30 days. So I don't think that, so there's clearly a lot of access to it. So access isn't the issue. I think what we're going to see now, like I said, is I think when you sunshine something, you have it out in the open, it allows us to address it in a more productive way. And I'm glad that Dr. Cantor's here, because we, at least at Berkeley Unified, have really taken a couple of steps to really try to address, to try to decrease cannabis use among our students, because it definitely impacts their school day, and it's and we're concerned about it. There's a lot of access to it in Berkeley, particularly. So one of the things that we do is that we've incorporated drug education in our 9th grade social living class, so that every 9th grader is has an opportunity to talk openly. A lot of the things that Dr. Cantor, I don't know if he's going to talk about them, has brought to the district, we've incorporated in that, so that kids can really hopefully understand the impact of smoking marijuana on their frontal lobe and their brain development, and we have kind of what we call a not yet. It's not an explicit policy, but like the not yet policy, which is really a harm reduction policy, which we borrowed from our consultant. And then when kids are found with less than an ounce of cannabis, the education code in many places is very strict about what has mandatory expulsion to suspensions. But if it's less than an ounce, you can apply alternative discipline. And so we've decided to invest in drug counselors on campus. So if kids are caught for the first time, and sometimes their second time, they as part of, instead of being suspended, which really, if you think about it, it's kind of ridiculous. A kid is, that you send them home where they are unsupervised where they can, probably, they have more opportunity to smoke or to use. So we have instead incorporated drug counseling and treatment into our alternative discipline matrix, so that we have an opportunity to really talk openly with our kids about about the impact of cannabis use on their adolescent brains. And I think that that's actually fits in consistently to an idea of with the messages that they're going to be seeing and that they're already starting to see about legalized adult use. So I actually feel very encouraged about this. I think we have found this with other things, that sunshining this and making it less of a covert, under the radar activity means that there's more opportunity for us to talk to our kids and really address their access and use of cannabis.
Okay, thank you. And I'm going to just have all the panelists speak, and then I'm going to open up to questions. So why don't we have Dale?
Yeah, so I've been working on the cannabis reform and legalization issue now for over 30 years, and I think one of the things I've had to battle against the most over all these years has been a certain paranoia about legalizing cannabis. Everybody seemed very fearful that this would open the door to Pandora's box of drug abuse and youth, smoking in schools and accidents and absenteeism from work and all of these other things. Now, none of these things are what we are actually observing in the legal states now. And even before we had legal states, I knew this wasn't the case because I'd been to the Netherlands, where since 1976, they've had shops, coffee shops, where anybody could go in, 18 or older, it used to be 16, it's 18 now, and buy cannabis, or hashish for that matter. And if you ever went to Amsterdam and saw this, you would see it created no problems whatsoever that were evident. Not only that, the Netherlands has one of the safest, the best employment safety records in all of Europe. It has one of the best traffic safety records in Europe, better than its neighboring countries, and it actually has less overall adult and youth cannabis use than most of the neighboring countries. It's about sort of in the middle rank of Europe. So I knew all of this hysteria really was just fear of the unknown. I'd like to go into a couple of these items in particular. The youth use, we've heard Susan and FANELLI and others have talked about this, how there doesn't seem to be any increase in youth use in California or any other state. I noticed there was just a news article out of Colorado following legalization. The rate of adolescent marijuana use in Colorado has fallen to its lowest level in nearly a decade. I also know in California, where there was data on this, that the state used to survey the secondary school students on their marijuana and other illegal drug use. And the highest point in the survey was around the year 1996, which is the exact year we legalized medical marijuana. It fell the next year and has declined or stayed steady ever since. I think the notion that we have to make things illegal for adult use in order to teach the kids what to do is a basically bogus notion. And I know I've always had, my daughter has been around marijuana like she's been around alcohol and other things that are for adults only for a long time. And, from the age of a toddler, and she always recognized these were things that adults are supposed to do and I can't do until, I'm of age. I'd also like, however, to talk about an issue that I know is very hot, about the worry about impaired driving and drug-impaired driving. Marijuana, yes, can impair driving, and there have been some accidents as a result of that. But marijuana is not terribly impairing compared to a lot of other drugs that are already out there. Legal prescription drugs, including benzodiazepines, and certainly prescription opiates. And certainly in all of the studies, and there's been a lot of work on this, all of the studies agree it's nowhere near as much of a danger on the road as alcohol and drunken driving. And if it should happen that marijuana would displace drunken driving to some extent, there would actually be a net savings in accident safety. I've got to say this is borne out to some extent by some recent studies have shown a correlation between access to medical marijuana and lower traffic accident fatalities. For whatever that's worth, there's also evidence that if you look at Washington and Colorado, the other legal states, their accident rates have not gone up at all. Some kids sort of declined or been steady. Washington has, I think, the second best traffic safety record in the entire country. Also, Colorado and California and Washington and Maine are all safer than the average as far as their roads are concerned. You know, it's not like when we legalized marijuana last November, all of a sudden people started driving with while smoking joints. They've been doing it for as long as I've been around in this business. And so there's no big change that has been affected, and we shouldn't expect any major impacts on driving fatalities at all. And I'm also happy to note that the DUI arrests in California have recently been declining. Last year was the lowest in over a decade. So, not a huge worry, but there are some concerns about marijuana, and there's been a lot of overemphasis on the notion that we need some scientific device like a breathalyzer to measure the amount of marijuana in your system and determine whether you are too stoned to drive. And I really think this is a fool's errand. All of the studies that have been done, and there have been many studies, I mean scores of studies on this issue, have found that you really cannot correlate a person's performance or driving impairment directly to some sort of level of THC in the blood, or certainly anything in the urine, because marijuana stays in the urine for weeks, or anything else. And this is not terribly surprising from a pharmacological perspective. Alcohol is actually a very unique drug. It is the only drug out there that when you take it, it really like perfuses your entire body, all of your cells, and you can sort of measure the activity in your brain by the amount that's in your breath or bloodstream very accurately. It is about the only such drug out there. Cannabis, on the other hand, and most other drugs, work on very specific receptors that are in the brain. And the amount that you might measure in the blood or the breath or whatever does not necessarily reflect what is actually gotten inside your brain or through the blood-brain barrier, if you've been eating edibles and your digestive system, you know, can wreak havoc with whatever's going on. You really cannot measure things by chemical testing very well. Well, what can you do? You can do what we're doing now, and I think it works very well, and frankly, I think that the California Highway Patrol does a good job of controlling drunken driving and drugged driving here in California. If you see somebody driving, if a cop sees somebody driving dangerously, you know, they stop them, then, you know, that's some cause for suspicion. If you smell some smoke, or, you know, even if you do a chemical test, like a swab test that they're developing, and that's their marijuana, and you say, well, you know, marijuana might have been involved. But you also do a field sobriety test where you see whether the person is actually capable of conducting themselves well. You know, you check their balance and ability to count and things like that. And that combination of tests can determine whether someone is under the influence. We've been using that for years. I think the system works well, and that's the way we should go. I think we should give up on the notion of, as I say, trying to develop the magic chemical device, but I think we should look a lot more at impairment testing. And there are now actually apps that you can get for your iPhone that you can use to test cannabis impairment. I have one here called My Canary. You can download it for free, that tests your memory and time perception and balance. If you can make your iPhone respond very well to your balance, which is a problem with my particular iPhone, but conceptually it's possible. But I think certainly there's room for a lot more development here. And I think we should look forward to a day when maybe we can have like a video game machine or something that we can put in the cannabis cafes and the bars and other places, something that people could test themselves on before they go out on the road. And I think that would be a lot more helpful than any more sophisticated chemical testing at this particular time. By the way, while I'm talking about this whole chemical testing thing, the issue of employment rights came out earlier, which are not guaranteed here in California, but this is a real problem because currently people can be denied all sorts of things. They can be denied medical treatment, they can be denied professional licensing, they can certainly be denied jobs based on the mere presence of marijuana, usually in their urine, and it's marijuana metabolites, and as we know, it stays in your system can stay in your system for weeks, has nothing to do with job fitness. Let me say there is no science behind this at all. People complain, our opponents always say, well, there's not enough study yet that's been done on medical marijuana. We don't really know that it's effective. Well, that National Academy of Sciences study that was referred to earlier, which reviewed the evidence quite thoroughly, did conclude, in fact, that marijuana appears to be clearly effective for relief of chronic pain, as well as for nausea and muscle spasticity. So they found compelling evidence to that effect. They also reviewed the evidence on employment drug testing. And the question is, do people who use marijuana, or does the presence of marijuana mean that you're a less effective worker? And they found there was no convincing evidence any way on this. In fact, there has never been a well-controlled scientific study, an FDA study, to show that this drug testing is either safe or effective. And yet it's being forced on millions of American workers against their will, even while they're being told there isn't enough evidence that they can use marijuana for medicine. And this has public health consequences, because it means if you're on a job where you're subject to random drug testing, suppose you have severe chronic pain, all right? Well, you can use opioids, all right? Because they're prescribed, it's a prescribed controlled substance. If you present your prescription, that's fine. But if you have medical marijuana, you're fired. Well, now we know there's lots of evidence that marijuana can help reduce and even eliminate the use of opioids specifically for chronic pain, as the National Academy of Sciences determined, and yet our drug testing policies are prohibiting that. So I think that's something else we should be looking at. With that, I think I will hand things over to the next panelist.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Cantor.
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me okay? Good. It's the old New York thing that I got going on here. So, I'm not a doctor.
You're not, Doctor.
I'm not a doctor.
You're looking at me.
I'm a high school teacher.
Okay.
And that's what I do here, and let's hear it for teachers. I also find it interesting for me to be up here because in some ways I think of a lot of us as being drug warriors, either for marijuana or against marijuana. I'm not a drug warrior. I'm not there. I'm an educator. I'm a high school teacher. And I want to see kids and adults learn some about marijuana. I'll tell you from my own personal thing, I was living in Greenwich Village, 1966. I wanted to smoke a joint, I would go into the back room, pull the shades, and do my thing. It's been 50 years. Thank God that it's gotten to be legalized. That's where I'm at. At the same time, it's called the Adult Use of Marijuana Act. I want people, the adults and the teenagers to understand, really understand why it is different for a teenager to smoke weed than it is for an adult, developmentally, biologically, in every other way. And I'd like so that finally we get to the point where an adult can say to a kid, listen, I want you to put your seatbelt on, okay? Listen, I don't want you to smoke weed. And here's why. But right now, I'm kind of blown away how little people really know about marijuana. And I think because it's so politicized and people telling you how good it is or telling you how bad it is, nobody knows very much about it at all. For instance, is marijuana an upper, a downer, or an all-arounder? What an interesting question. See, because one of the things that teenagers do is they do something called crossfading. And what crossfading is about is mixing alcohol and weed together, okay? So then they listen to a rapper who comes along and says, listen, you really want to get drunk? Crossfade with alcohol and Xanax. That'll get you really drunk, okay? Well, that will kill you. And it has for some students here in Alameda County. We need some education about it. And thank you. And we need the education. And one of the ways it works for me in doing this education is non-judgmentally. This is what the drug does. This is how the drug works. And this is why it is different for a teenager than it is for an adult. And I'll tell you, the people that really see this are us folks that are working in schools and see the effect that marijuana has on kids, and particularly the effect that marijuana has on kids that are going to alternative continuation schools, the kids that are more marginalized. Here's where the marijuana has a huger impact. You look at that California Healthy Kids Survey, and you look at the usage in these alternative schools, it's off the charts. And what it does is it really interferes with them trying to figure out, how do I deal with my stress? How do I deal with my anger? How do I deal with my depression? How do I have fun? What interests me? All that stuff is what's supposed to happen during teenage time. And so mostly what I want is for the adult community first to really understand why it is different for teenagers to smoke weed than it is for adults. So that adults don't have to feel like they're compromised, because, you know, I teach in Northern California a lot, and I'll have a teacher say to me, listen, I'm growing 6 plants in my backyard. How can I tell my kids not to smoke weed? You know, and I'm thinking, she's getting $35,000 a year. She gets an extra $15,000 from the plants. And it is, if you go to Napa County, you can have people that are running vineyards, okay, and even involve the kids in the running of the vineyards, and they can still say to the child, I don't want you to drink alcohol now. It is not appropriate, and they really understand that. That's where I would like the adult community to be with marijuana. Because right now the kids are not getting that message. People are it's amazing how little is really understood about the drug. And it's not rocket science. In some ways, yes, there's a lot to be learned, but there's a lot to really understand now. How does it affect the hippocampus, this thing with memory? It makes things seem fresh and new for a while, but it also affects memory. How does it affect the cerebellum? So back in 1966, when I did smoke that weed, I'm really grateful for two things. Number one, I was 23 years old. Number two, it was only 1 to 3% THC. It is a different drug now. People don't understand the drug. And let me tell you, when I went to high school back then in New York, cigarettes was a normalized thing. Whether you'd smoked or not, it was part of the culture. Well, today, marijuana looks like what cigarettes looked like in the 50s in school. Even though the statistics aren't saying everybody uses, if a friend is using, it's not seen as aberrant behavior. It's a norm. If a kid is smoking a cigarette, then people, whoa, what are you doing here? You're smoking a cigarette? Don't you know about that? We need to get to that place with marijuana as well. We need for people to understand we got to get off of the good and the bad and begin to learn about how marijuana works on the brain. And the most important thing is, why is it different for a teenager to smoke weed than it is for an adult? If the adult community as a group can really put that message out, it doesn't mean kids aren't going to smoke, but at least they're finally getting a message and understanding, hey, my folks don't want me to do this, or hey, there's really a problem with this. And I think it's done non-judgmentally. I think it's done in a personal way. And I think that what else do I want? I'm going to shut up on this thing, but that is the main message, though, that I would love for the adult community to get first. That is different for a teenager to smoke weed than an adult. And then I'd like the teenagers to understand that. Thank you.
See why I call him doctor, right?
So Ralph's worked with me in the past to put on forums around this. And before I call on Jennifer, who also has worked with me, I'd just like for Ralph to tell the story about when you were a student asked you, Mr. Cantor, what do you know about weed and why shouldn't I smoke it, and how it will kind of not have that kid stimulated to do things. You've told the story before.
Got it. But I actually, when I teach in classrooms. And I very rarely do assemblies either, because I think, and I want to say something about this drug marijuana. It's very nuanced. I always saw it as the Achilles heel in drug education. It's not like alcohol. It's not, and for peer educators, you can get peer educators to teach sex education, and use a condom. You can get peer educators to teach about tobacco or alcohol. But weed is a very nuanced. It's not as simple. And one of the things around it is that it fires off this drug, dopamine, okay? And what dopamine is really about, it's beyond pleasure. What dopamine is really about is the what's important filter. When something is important to you, you got juice for it, like watching a Warriors game or whatever it is, that high interest, that's dopamine, okay? And for kids, in teenage time, they need to figure out what fires off dopamine for me. Am I a people person? Am I a science person? Who am I? Where are my interests? Where is my juice? That's their work at this point, is to figure out, how do I deal with my stress? How do I figure out which direction I want to go in? And this dopamine thing is a really important compass to teach that. To come in during this teenage time and to play with that reward system and to trick the brain into firing off this dopamine. Well, number one, you don't really learn what the real thing is about. You're busy doing it this way. Number two, during this time, it gets hardwired in. And then if a kid has to go into rehab afterwards, what do they rehab to if they never did form these things in the first place? They never did figure out, how do I deal with my anger, my stress, my interest, where is my juice? And so my biggest lesson for kids is, you need to get a life. You need to wait. The weed is going to be there. Right now, you need to figure out what makes you feel alive and what interests you. And doing it during this developmental time in the brain, there's two things that are going on: myelination and pruning. The things that they don't practice at this point drop away, they get pruned away, and the things that they do practice get hardwired in. It's a very crucial time in development. That's what I want the teenagers to know, and that's what I want the adults to know, so the adults can feel real clear to be able to give this message. But right now, we are not. And here this thing is right around the corner, and I think most adults are kind of standing flat-footed, like deer in a headlight, not really knowing, what's the next place to go here. We are in desperate need of understanding why it is different for a teenager to smoke marijuana than it is for an adult. I am not anti-marijuana, but boy, we need to grow up on this stuff. There's so little understanding about marijuana. I can't believe it. And I don't want to see it roll in the same way that cigarettes rolled in the 50s. I want us to do some things on the front end here to do some real work, not have to figure it out many years down the road.
Yeah. All right. The next speaker is Jennifer Ellis.
Hi. Thank you so much for sticking with us through the whole day. One of the liabilities of being one of the last speakers is you may hear me echo some things that my very well-spoken colleagues said. As I said, my name is Jennifer Ellis. I'm on staff with La Familia, which provides a lot of social and community advocacy services in central and southern Alameda County. But I'm also the project director for Ashland Cherryland Together, which is a coalition that brings residents and young people together with stakeholders to make decisions at the nexus of substance use and youth. We work in the Ashland Cherryland community. That's a little unincorporated area kind of tucked between San Leandro and Hayward, right on the 238. And this community, because it is unincorporated, it does lack some of the benefits of city infrastructure that you and I get to appreciate every day. And so some of our young people, while this community is up and coming, are especially vulnerable. And so when Supervisor Miley's office asked my partner Elsa and I to come to the table to be part of this initiative, we were super excited that those young people were going to get represented from the get-go. I want to talk about prevention for a minute, because I think that prohibitionists are getting kind of a bad rap. There's a lot of like reefer madness talk going on today. And for me, and I think for the other people on this panel, that's not what it's about. You know, a lot of people woke up the day after Prop 64 became legal, a lot of preventionists, and they were confused and they were angry and they were like, how could this happen? And that's not how I woke up. I woke up thinking, this is an opportunity. This is an opportunity to right some of the social injustices against people of color that have existed in our state. I woke up thinking, this is an opportunity to create stable funding streams for prevention so that I can do what I do better. And I also woke up thinking, some states that have legalized marijuana are actually seeing things trend downward with their opioid-related deaths. Right? So marijuana can be part of these solutions. At the same time, we have to do it intentionally. When I think about prevention, I do think about messaging, and that's mostly what I'm here to talk about today. But for me, it's part of a package, and that package has to do with policies that limit access to our young people. It has to do with increased access to treatment services. I'm so excited about what Berkeley schools are doing in terms of diversion, but are there enough slots countywide for our young people to get that help when they need it? And also, I think about smart environmental design, SEPDED type stuff. If we're going to have dispensaries, are we going to do it in a way where the environment is actually safe? So I'm so excited about the ordinances that Supervisor Miley said will pass their desk in March, right? Are we building this package? And as a complement to this package, one of the lead dominoes in this initiative is going to be a youth education and awareness campaign. And so I'm excited that I get to be the person who sits up here and tells you about the launch of Alameda County's CEYAA initiative. So CEYAA stands for Cannabis Education for Youth and Adult Awareness. You guys saw Let's Talk Cannabis up here, which is definitely in phase 1. There's more stuff to come. And we're saying, okay, how do we learn what the state's going to do and be really intentional in Alameda County? If they don't build something that's strong enough or customized enough, if the people in their ads don't look or sound like us, like our young people, how are we going to augment it? How are we going to do it better? And so what we've come up with, this is kind of the best minds we could pull together in Alameda County, including Supervisor Miley's office, including other prevention coalitions like the Hayward Coalition for Healthy Youth. ACOE was at that table, public health, right? As many folks, industry people, as many folks as we could come together. What were our best thinking? And here it is. It's a 3-prong approach. The first one is all centered around the message that weed can wait. Those words were actually adopted as a campaign by young people at the RAICH Ashland Youth Center. So this idea that it's not that weed is inherently bad, but right, it's inappropriate based on brain development. And I think we all know that, right? We know that the The prefrontal cortex, we know that the part of the brain that does cause and effect isn't especially well developed in young people, but the parts of the brain that do emotional and risk-taking behaviors are super well developed in our teenagers, right? And so what that means is they're not especially good at saying, oh, I only need to have one, puff or one, I only need to have one beer because I've got a test tomorrow. They're not good at like making those trade-offs. What we see with drinking is that you have about 39% of students in Hayward, for example, saying, yes, I've had at least one beer or one drink of alcohol in the last 30 days. So that's almost 40%. 19 of them said, I had 5 or more in one sitting. So, right, like half of the kids who are drinking a lot at one time, and it's because they don't know how to self-regulate very well. And so part of what we're saying is weed can wait, right? When you are 21, when you're an adult, you can, recreate. But right now, it's not appropriate. You have aspirations. Which kind of leads me to one of the points that Ralph made and to the second component of the campaign, which really has to do with parents. So parents come up to me and they say, hey, Jen, I smoked pot when I was a young person and now I don't know like how to talk to my kids, right? Like I don't want to feel like a hypocrite. And here's how you talk to your kids. And this is going to be embedded in our campaign. But spoiler alert, here it is. You draw a line in the sand. You tell your kids what the consequences are when they step over that line, and then you follow through. And it's not that you're a hypocrite, it's that you're a strong parent. And I can't think of anything that most of our communities need here in Alameda County more than strong parents. And so part of what we're going to message is how adults can have those conversations, right? And I'm not necessarily telling you what that line is. Your family's values is for you to create, but we've got to be consistent and our young people have to know what our expectations are. And so doing that education network with parents and with youth-serving professionals, with teachers, is the second step in our campaign. The third step is really what does legal and responsible use look like? And we're really excited about that. I think Let's Talk Cannabis is going to be a really good first step in that direction. But how do we put an Alameda County stamp on it, especially as the ordinances roll out here in Alameda County? I have young adults come up to me and be like, hey, Jen, it's going to be legal. I can't get fired. And I'm like, nope, right? Because they don't know. And so part of this campaign about what legal and responsible use looks like is really just informing you and me and them about what this really means, right? We've heard a lot of comparisons to alcohol today. I also think that it's kind of an imperfect match. I would argue, and people will push back, that drinking a glass of wine in front of your young person is going to be different than like lighting something up, right? The risk of secondhand smoke is different. And how do we tell people what those expectations are? And so as part of this third tier of the campaign, we're really going to be looking at what does legal and responsible use look like. We've all heard, I think today, that this is not your mama's pot, right? This is something different that we are dealing with. And so built into all three parts of this campaign, that's kind of the message, right? Is that we need to be more intentional in order to protect our young people. What I want to say to close is that everything that we're rolling out, everything we're testing is a collaborative effort. And so if you're like, no, you guys are totally off base, we want you at the table. Please come to the table because we appreciate that partnership and we appreciate that engagement. The other thing is that none of this would be possible without the commitment and the instinct and the leadership of Supervisor Nate Miley's office. And so I just want to take this moment to appreciate him for the summit and also for his leadership on this issue in our county. And with that, CEYAA is officially launched in Alameda County. So you will see stuff come from us. You will see emails. You will hopefully start to see billboards and print media and things like that. I would say probably mid-2018. But definitely get involved early if this is something you really care about. Thank you.
Jennifer might have been the last speaker, but she just nailed it. She really nailed it. So, and like I said, I've worked with Jennifer in the past and Ralph, and I know Dale from a long time. But I've seen Ralph make presentations to young people, and it's amazing, and it's entertaining, and it's informative. I can't deliver it nearly as well and as knowledgeable as this guy can, and then Jennifer is right on point. So let's see what kind of questions folks have. I know one person called in and said, what are the ramifications for infusing health and beauty aid products? Does anybody have a
Health?
Yeah.
It was for the first panel.
Beauty aid products.
That was for the first panel.
That was for the first panel?
It was for the afternoon panel with the lawyers. You're fine. You can move on, Supervisor.
Okay. Questions, people, if you have questions, come to the mic, please.
And just to your question that you just asked, because I actually am a ganjapreneur developing bath products, and I would say that in my development over the past year, I think dosage and concentration level has been something that I've really looked into, just ensuring, and even in my own testing of the product, just ensuring that, because I lost my cell phone one time. I think my dosage was too high, so dropped my cell phone in the tub. But that's just something, just to your question that you said earlier. So I'm still learning that as well with the health and beauty products. I have bath bombs, I have bubble bars, I have bath melts, bars of soap. So me just figuring out the concentration and the dosage and the effects, I've been kind of working on that for the past 3 weeks. Yeah. So, but I did have 2 questions. Sorry. My first question, I'm sorry, my name's Kinshasa Taylor. I'm from Berkeley. I'm also a commissioner in Berkeley. I do a lot of work with the county offices. I'm familiar also with the slogan, my girlfriend used to work at Ashland, so I have one of the t-shirts that the weed can wait. She gave it to me as a joke, but I think that the campaign is very effective, and good luck to you and whatever I can do to help. But 2 things that came to mind, and I don't know if I missed it. The first was, I thought about my neighbor across the street. She's 22 years old, and they always talk to me about all the drugs that they try. And her comment to me, she said, my mom put me on prescription drugs when I was 10. Had I had an alternative other than the prescription drugs, I probably wouldn't be 22. So that's something when you're thinking about the youth and all of the medicine that they're giving our kids with ADHD, and if there are alternatives, just thinking about that being a gateway, for a lack of a better term. And then the other thing, and I'm not sure if I've missed it, is I've may have missed the conversation that we're having around equity involving this. One of the things that concerns me in January is all of the folks that are on parole and probation for being marijuana dealers. And what I'm wondering is, what is the county, when we're talking about adult awareness, how are we in helping to engage, educate, and inform those folks to the permitting system that is going to be in effect after January, so that they can sign up for those petitions? What are we doing to help those folks that are already have been incarcerated or on probation or parole for selling marijuana? Because now being a drug dealer in California is a cool thing.
Yeah, this panel isn't focused on that. I mean, if someone wants to respond, they can. But
the second question or the
second question.
Okay.
The district attorney, she was here. She spoke to that question, as well as Robert RAICH spoke to that.
Okay.
And this is being recorded, so if you go back and look at that panel.
I watched part of it, and then I got in the car because I thought that and then I drove here. So that's why I was saying I don't know if I missed that. But when we're talking about the youth, like I said, and we're giving them so many prescription drugs, and we're looking at different things and how marijuana can be conceived as a gateway, I think we need to look at all of the prescription drugs as being a gateway for those kids, because that's what my neighbor told me. She said, that's why I try everything. She said, my mom put me on Ritalin and all of this stuff at 10. I'm 22. Why wouldn't I try everything? So I think we need to look at that, the pharmaceuticals effect on that as well.
Danny?
I have one thing I want to say. One of the things that I see people do, because marijuana affects the cerebellum and slows things down for a while. So kids that are ADD or ADHD are more attracted to the drug because it chills that out for a while. The problem is that once the drug wears off, the kids get more ADD than they were before. There's this, rebound effect. Where, and I'm not a drug pusher one way or the other, but as a teacher, I've seen for a number of kids that really have ADD or ADHD, if they go on, Cervexa or whatever that drug is to counteract the ADHD, it works 24/7. And so they're not bouncing back and forth here. And I think that it can really be an aid to learning. So I don't want to, throw out the baby with the bathwater. I do understand what you're saying. But the problem with marijuana is it's a very short-term effect, and then you got this bounce back stuff. And I think people will use it the same way for depression instead of going on, these things are not simple. Everybody's brain is different. The way it affects one person is different than the way it affects the other. I think we have to have an open mind around all this stuff, and it's going to be a learning curve that we're all on. But I'm just finding that kids that are using the marijuana, it's not really enhancing their learning, or it does help them to chill for a while. It does put a smile on their face for a while, but not at this time. Anyway, but I think that some of those drugs can work at different times because you don't have that bounce back effect.
Thank you.
Okay, next question.
Thank you, Ralph. Thank you very much. As a pharmacist, first I want to thank you for calling it a drug. It is a drug. Okay, so we need to know that. One of my concerns is that some of the statistics that I have seen and encountered is out of Colorado that there was a 58% increase among African American usage of kids between 12 and 17, and 29% increase among Hispanics. This came out of the Public Health Department of Colorado. So I'm kind of concerned about what statistics are really there. I've heard things, not scare tactics, but, real numbers are regarding this. So when we do their teaching, we need to focus on groups that are really more vulnerable. I'm really concerned about that, okay? And also I'd like to...
And particularly in schools, it's those alternative schools,
yes,
and it's those continuation schools.
Absolutely.
Where the usage is so off the charts, and where we need to, in some way, have more focused...
Absolutely.
And can I jump in there? Because California Department of Health did show us the 7th, 9th, and 11th grade numbers. They didn't show us the non-traditional school numbers. Typically what we see is when 11th grade is hovering around 20%, non-traditional students are hovering around 35%.
That's right.
So 1 in 3 at least.
That's right, correct. So we need to, have the real facts. These are not scare tactics. This is not reefer madness. This is the facts. And also in regards to the Netherlands, you have a homogeneous group there. Of course, you have less alcoholic use and has the problems. In this country, in California, our diversity is such, and we do have an alcoholic problem, and as we do have tobacco problem. We have 480,000 people dying to tobacco-related diseases, as an example. So we don't want to get there with, with pot also. And that's my concern as a pharmacist, as a community member, and as an educator also. So I thank you for taking that time to clarify some things. Thank you.
Welcome. And I want to say that I believe that because it's affecting the more marginalized kids more, it's really adding to that achievement gap rather than closing it down.
But I just wanted to go back to what Ralph was talking about regarding how we then address that with our young people, because I think that's where the education piece has to come in. I guess both Jen and Ralph, because that's what we have found, that, if you have kids, it can be the cycle, right? You have kids who come in, and then if they're caught smoking weed and then you suspend them, then they become less and less engaged with school, and then there's no incentive to stop. And so I think that's why the open education, and I think this kind of the sunshine and the opportunity to kind of pivot a little bit the way as a society we're addressing our young people who are using or who are thinking about using cannabis it's an opportunity, and sure, we have to do that with an equity lens. We need to do that across the board in our educational system, look at culturally appropriate and relevant teaching. And I think that's true in the case of marijuana too.
Hi, I'm Sally Burke. I'm with East Bay Cannabis Community, and we're all about education too. One of the things that concerns me about this discussion is that cannabis is a medicine, and it is You can call it a drug, but it's a medicine. I had cancer. My cancer is gone. How do we tell children we don't want them using it? However, it is a medicine. There's no benefit to alcohol. There's no benefit to tobacco. There are a lot of benefits to cannabis, and I think that message is being lost here. I realize it's a fine line to straddle, but I think we have to straddle it because it doesn't make sense to my teenage son that I'm using cannabis for my cancer and he can't use it. We're getting mixed messages all over the place. That's it.
I guess one of the questions, how do you keep your kids out of the medicine closet in general? I mean, if it is a medicine, it's like a lot of other medicines, and you tell your kids not to take the medicines. I think that's really important. I would like to say that there is some evidence, good evidence for youthful use of cannabis in certain psychiatric conditions, including ADHD, by some respectable pediatricians and some other researchers. And it's a very delicate issue, and there's lots of different adolescents out there in a lot of different situations. But at the end of the day, I think I really like this "weed can wait" slogan, by the way.
Yeah.
I think that's a lot better than just saying no.
Yeah,
really. We ought to be telling the kids though what the cannabis does, rather than saying don't do this.
Let me say something else for the adult community. A lot of people have drugs in their lives, weed, alcohol, or whatever, and they're functioning and doing real well, okay? The thing is that it takes a level of sophistication to have alcohol or another drug in your life. Teenagers don't have that level of sophistication. And I don't teach this to teenagers, but I think the adults really need to get that biologically the teenagers are not all the way up in their prefrontal cortex. They're not able to, in stages of development, they haven't gotten to that place yet. So it's necessary for the adults to be the prefrontal cortex for their kids at this point. They need to step up to the plate more on this because the kids are just not there. Kids really, for the most part, don't have a glass of Cabernet. It's not the way they do things. And that's the same with the weed. And I think it's unfair for the alcohol industry to say, listen, we don't want you drinking and driving, but we want people to drink responsibly, okay? Kids don't drink they're not at that developmental place that adults are.
And Ralph, maybe you could tell the story about a kid eating an apple, not on marijuana, and eating an apple on marijuana.
So here's, God bless you. One of the things that marijuana does is it cuts out memory for a while. Hang on, don't go away. It cuts out memory for a while. And when you cut out memory for a while, you're not bringing that into the picture. So if you pick up an apple and you take a bite out of an apple, normally you're thinking, oh, well, is this a red apple, a green apple, a yellow apple? You have all this apple experience, and then you bite into the apple. But you smoke weed and it knocks all of that memory stuff out. Now you bite into the apple and it's like biting into an apple for the first time. Things seem, and it's part of the glow of a marijuana high. The issue on it, though, is that marijuana stays in your system quite a long time. It's fat soluble. So that hippocampus that was impaired and made the apple taste good, after the high wears off, that hippocampus is still impaired. It takes a number of days for it to come back to full working order. And this is the thing on a number of these things, is that people just need to understand more about the drug, about what we're talking about here in terms of the method of ingestion. And the biggest thing is the potency is off the charts. And it's so much part of high school culture today. You can't, I got a 16-year-old boy that goes to Berkeley High. Wow, what an insight that I could never see. And here I was a teacher, I could never see it the way I do. But from the rap music to what's hip to what's cool, it isn't even a matter of liking the drug. It's a matter of being hip. Is that the right word, hip? They don't say hip anymore.
Okay. I don't have a...
Oh, it's not cool. I thought so. It's so weird.
You're not hip. Right.
Could you introduce yourself?
Hi, everyone. My name is Tasha. I really don't have a question. It's more of like what you just touched on about like peer pressure and being cool. Nowadays, it's not cool to say no. You know, I just want parents to teach their kids that it's okay to be different. Be that one that stand out and say no. And that's all I had to say.
Thank you. Thank you. All right, I think this will be the last question.
I just want to say that I've been across California going to these cannabis conferences. And I can see that, of course, it's a multi-billion-dollar business. And, of course, most of the participants and panelists are not African American. And the thing that concerns me the most is African American males and the African American youth are a lot of times selling cannabis because they needed to supplement their income. We can't address the whole social inequities of the system against minorities, but what I see is this is going to be a very big economic opportunity, and I hope some of the educational efforts like Oaksterdam Community will show these displaced African American males how to run a cannabis business. It's also going to be very hard for them. I've been listening to the numbers. Like I said, I've been to a number of the cannabis conferences, and it's very prohibitive for African American males or young people to get the funds together as the society looks now to operate a cannabis business, and now it is really going to be prohibited. So where they used to get the income to supplement themselves because of all sorts of things in their family disintegrated structure, what are they going to do now? They're not going to be able to do the business that has supplemented their income because now it's illegal. And now you have to have every plant tagged and UID and what do you think is going to happen to all of those young men? Oaksterdam University, yeah. So as part of your educational thing, that's a large population. A lot of them are in jail now. They're incarcerated. But please look at the large number of people that are going to lose their economic means. They can't get regular jobs. They haven't been able to get regular jobs because of prison sentences that were a lot of times related to drugs. So I'm not trying to do the question that went to the other panel. I'm doing the educational question now. How to run a cannabis business, how to get the money to run a cannabis business. I think that's very important.
Yeah, I'm going to speak to that. So in my other hat that I wear at La Familia, I do youth workforce development. And I had a 19-year-old young man who's African American come to me over the summer, and he was like, Jen, I think I want to go to Oaksterdam. And I was like, okay, what are their outcomes, right? Like, is this like going to like the ITT Tech of pot? Like, I don't know. And so really I think it's developing those critical thinking skills. And if Oaksterdam Oaksterdam is proving effective at getting young people jobs, like, heck yeah, let's put our young people like through those programs. I do think there are going to be a ton of jobs coming out of this industry. And I think it's about us being really intentional about how we talk to our young people about those opportunities.
I'm saying something different. I'm not saying getting jobs. I'm saying running a business because these young African American men had their own businesses.
I mean, I think they are very entrepreneurial, and I wonder what opportunities could exist there. I think you make a really good point.
I hope you heard what I said.
Yeah, I think it's a very good point. And
Good.
You want to say something else?
I'd like to refer to that for a second. I think part of what you're saying that is important to understand that I would like to see is a bunch of the intervention and education money be targeted at particular populations rather than try to, spread this thing over the whole. There's certain populations that are getting more hit by this than there are others, and that goes the same in schools too. Rather than just try to do this general prevention education, to begin to identify the kids that really are in trouble and having problems here, and have the money focused on them. The other concern around this money thing that I got that's sitting here, it's different from tobacco, this marijuana thing. For tobacco, the California Department of Education got money, and public health got money. Now, with this, all the money's going to go to public health. So I wonder how are we going to, in order to make this work, the way we made it work with cigarettes was we got all the people on board together that are working together on this stuff. That's part of what we're going to need to figure out here, and I think that's part of what you're trying to do with this group is to what do I want to say? Have a cooperation across the board so that some people are dealing with the media, some people are dealing with what's going on in schools, some people are dealing with the laws. It's got to be a whole bunch of groups that are working together around this as we, in my opinion, embrace the legalization of marijuana for adults. How do we really separate that out and focus on giving kids a clear message that we haven't done up to now?
I totally agree with that. I wanted to acknowledge that I hear we're talking about youth, and what I heard you, and correct me if I'm wrong, but what I heard you talking about was much more addressing the kind of the structural inequities around the economics of it that are already in place, and how can we help level the playing field. And when we have a fully black market adult use system, that to some extent was a little bit more available to everyone equally. And so I think there are efforts going on, I know here in Oakland and other places, to try to address, create opportunities for very small micro businesses, particularly focused on folks who are most impacted by the war on drugs. And I think that I'm really glad that you brought that up, because I think it's something we need to continue to be intentional about. So I just wanted to acknowledge. I heard that you weren't really talking about the youth education piece, but more just how are we creating opportunities.
Right.
Yeah, starting with the youth. Yeah.
So this panel is more focused on one aspect, but when we have our next summit, that's going to be something we queue up. We're looking at community benefit. We're looking at equity. Patricia Brooks, who's African American, is my main policy person on this, serves on a cannabis equity committee for the state, right? So we're looking at that, and even in the RFPs and the ultimate permits that we allow here in Alameda County, we want to have a community benefit equity component. We're not telling folks what that needs to be, but they need to have something, and then we'll evaluate what that is.
Supervisor Miley,
so we're going to queue that up for sure at our next summit, along with along with taxing and banking, along with other matters that we weren't able to cover as in depth or even scratch the surface on today.
Thank you. Excuse me, Supervisor Miley, and also Supervisor Miley, in addition to chairing CEYAA, he also chairs CEYAA, which stands for Cannabis Equity for All. If you're interested in joining that committee, please contact me. Thank you, Supervisor.
All right, it's been a very long afternoon. Why don't we give these folks on this panel applause? And I really hope those of you who were here all day, because I do see some faces that were here all day, and those of you who tuned in, either webcast or live stream, I hope you found this to be helpful. Please fill out those survey forms, those evaluation forms, so it can help us in terms of planning for our next summit, because we do want to do another summit, at least one more, because this is a new industry that's going, and it's going to touch many aspects and facets of our lives, and there are multiple opportunities in many different ways. And so as this begins to kind of come out, we want to stay abreast of it and see how we can help the public, help the industry, help government, help schools, help the whole range of our society be informed about this industry and how best to embrace it, regulate it, and make it work for the public good. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Panel, may we please have the panel step down here for a photo, please, with Supervisor Miley? Thanks, everyone, for coming. We really appreciate it. There's also a reception in honor of our Colorado attorney who spoke earlier, Chris, in the back of the room. You can pick up a form from one of our volunteers. We'd like to thank our volunteers today, all of them, for coming this morning, and we'll see you again next summer. Thanks a lot.